You're like a circle that floats around me, keeping me safe and sound.
Have you ever bitten into, say, a slice of pizza and just stopped and wondered how on earth did they get this crust so incredibly crisp, like shatteringly crisp, but the inside is still, perfectly tender and airy? Or maybe it was a loaf of artisan bread with that amazing open structure. Well, it's often about way more than just the basic flour, water, and yeast.
That's right. There's often something more going on behind the scenes.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're definitely pulling back the curtain on a really fascinating, almost foundational technique in, let's call it advanced baking. We're unlocking the secrets of something called biga.
Ah, yes, biga, a powerful pre-ferment that Italian bakers have really perfected over the years.
Absolutely. And you've given us an incredible stack of sources to work with here, detailed video tutorials, some essential guides. Our mission today is basically to distill all that core knowledge about biga. We'll go from the fundamental concepts, what it even is, right through to some pretty sophisticated applications. The goal is to help you understand not just the what, but really the why it's such a game changer for your baking.
And we've got some surprising facts and practical tips tucked away in there too.
Definitely. Let's unpack this.
Okay, so to really get biga, it helps to start with the basics of how doughs are generally put together. Most people, especially home bakers, are probably familiar with what's called the direct method.
Right, that's just chucking everything in the bowl at once, isn't it? Flour, water, yeast, salt, mix it up, done.
Exactly. All ingredients combined in one go, super straightforward. But then our sources talk a lot about the indirect method.
Okay, so what's the difference there? How does that work?
Well, the indirect method is more of a two-phase process. You start by making something called a pre-ferment.
A pre-ferment, like a starter dough.
Sort of, yeah. It's a smaller initial dough, usually just flour, water, and a tiny bit of yeast. This little batch goes through its own fermentation first for quite a while sometimes.
Okay.
And only then do you incorporate that pre-ferment into your final dough, along with the rest of your ingredients.
Gotcha. And biga specifically fits into the solid pre-ferment category, right? As opposed to liquid ones. What does that mean? Solid versus liquid.
That's a really key distinction. Solid pre-ferments, like biga, are defined by their lower hydration. We're talking typically 45% to maybe 60% water relative to the flour weight. Much drier, much stiffer.
Okay, 45–60%. That is pretty low.
It is. And that's very different from liquid pre-ferments, like a poolish maybe, which can be 80% or even 100% hydrated. Basically a wet batter consistency. Biga is much firmer.
Right, and the sources kept bringing up one specific classic version, the biga girilli. Sounds important. What makes that one the standard?
It really is the classic, the codified Italian pre-ferment. It was standardized by Maestro Pier Giorgio Girilli. Its standard recipe, if you will, is flour hydrated at a very precise 45%.
45%.
Wow. And crucially, with only 1% yeast relative to the flour weight in the biga itself. And then it ferments, typically for 16 to 24 hours, at a very tightly controlled temperature, 18 to 20 degrees Celsius.
That sounds incredibly precise. 16 to 24 hours at exactly 18 to 20 C. Are there any variations allowed, or is it totally rigid?
Well, Maestro Girilli did build in some flexibility. For certain flours, maybe something like semolina, you can push the hydration slightly up to 50%.
Okay.
And while that 1% yeast is pretty much fixed, you can extend the fermentation even up to 48 hours, but only if you drop the temperature significantly down to maybe 12, 14 degrees.
I see. Cooler temp, longer time.
Exactly. But the core idea is that fixed yeast percentage and that carefully controlled environment. That's where biga gets its predictable power.
So, okay, why bother? Why go through this whole extra step, this pre-ferment thing, when the direct method seems so much easier? What's the actual payoff?
Well, I like to think of it as fermentation by proxy. Biga does the heavy lifting, the bulk of the initial fermentation, before it even meets the rest of the dough.
Fermentation by proxy. I like that.
It accelerates the later stages of dough development in the final mix, and it leads to a much more controlled overall process. You get significant alcoholic fermentation happening in the biga, and higher acidity develops there too.
And what does that actually do for the final bread or the pizza or whatever comes out of the oven? What difference do we taste or see?
Oh, it translates into dramatically better qualities. You'll see a more open, airy structure inside, the crumb. And for things like pizza or focaccia, you get much thinner, much crispier crusts, the flavor and aroma, way richer, much more complex, a depth you just don't get from a quick direct dough.
Okay, that makes sense.
Plus, and this is really interesting, the alcohol and the acidity developed in the biga act like natural preservatives. They actually slow down the staling process.
Seriously, so it lasts longer.
Yeah, it extends the shelf life quite noticeably. So the key insight here isn't just that it's an extra step. It's a fundamental shift in managing fermentation to build superior structure, flavor, and longevity.
That's amazing. It really does sound like a shortcut to significantly better baking. Okay, so for those of us listening, wanting to try this at home, what are the fundamental principles? How do we actually prepare a biga?
Right. The absolute most crucial thing, the number one rule with biga, is that it's misalato grossolanamente.
Misalato grossolanamente. Okay, what's that mean?
It translates basically to coarsely mixed. You are not aiming for a smooth, developed, fully kneaded dough ball. Not at all.
Really? So no kneading?
Very little, if any. The goal is a rough, sort of crumbly, homogeneous mixture of small, broken pieces. You want to actively avoid developing the gluten early on. That's key for the long fermentation it needs to go through.
Got it. Coarse, rough mix. Avoid gluten development. What else?
The container matters, too. The sources strongly recommend using a low, wide container.
Low and wide. Why is that?
It helps the biga cool down quickly and evenly right to its core. Especially important if you're going to be moving it into a colder environment, like the fridge method we'll talk about. Helps prevent the center staying too warm.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, practical approaches then. Let's say someone does have a controlled environment, maybe a proofing box or that fancy oven setting. How do they make the classic biga?
Okay, for the classic approach, dissolve your tiny amount of yeast in the water first, then add your flour. Start mixing maybe with a fork, just drawing the dry flour up from the bottom. Then switch to your hands, but just gently bring it all together into those characteristic small, rough pieces.
You're like a circle that floats around me,
Lightly oil your
keeping
low,
me
wide container.
safe and
Spread the
sound.
biga pieces evenly